Welcome to the 1994 Midwest Detroit Home Education Conference. This is a Saturday afternoon workshop with Sam Blumenfeld entitled Outcome-Based Education.
Good afternoon. Well, this is our workshop or seminar, or whatever you want to call it, on outcome-based education. I'm sure that most of you have heard of outcome-based education and are rather concerned. If you're homeschooling, of course, you will be able to escape what outcome-based education is going to do to this country. As a matter of fact, your children will have a tremendous advantage over all of those children who are going to be schooled by OBE, because at least your children will know how to read and write, will be literate, and I can assure you that literacy, high literacy, is something that's going to be very much needed in the future. And those who have it, those who can command the written language, are going to be able to master this society. Those who aren't are going to be the victims. But you have to understand that what the ultimate goal of OBE is. What is outcome-based education? It's the education system for the new world order. To put it as simply as possible, that's what it is. The powers that be realize that if they want their new world order, they have to create an education system that will mitigate resistance to the New World Order, you see. Now, who are those people who are you might say, the source of the greatest resistance to the New World Order? Who are they in the English-speaking world? Remember, this is an international thing. It's not just the United States. It involves every country in the world. It involves the globe. Well, the chief resistors to the New World Order are the believing Christians. Are they not? The believing Christians represent the one single biggest obstacle to the creation of a pagan, socialist New World Order. We know it's going to be pagan because if you attend any of these environmental conferences, you will see that it's paganism from beginning to end, you know, with their worship of Gaia and the Earth Mother and all of that. And you know it's going to be socialist because that's what their plans call for as far as a controlled economy. A controlled economy is going to be a socialist economy. Even though they're going to have private firms, maybe it'll be more like fascism rather than socialism. So the thing that they have to do is educate the people to accept the New World Order. And since 85% of the Christians in the English-speaking world put their children in the public schools, their aim is to de-Christianize the children. And by de-Christianizing the children, they will get rid of the chief obstacle to their pagan socialist plans. And so the only people who will be left to resist will be a rather small remnant, basically. And what they will do with the small remnant is that they will Wacoize that remnant. See, they had their practice session down in Waco, Texas. So they know how to handle that. Is that working all right?
No.
We're getting a bit of an echo. Is this okay? Are you getting a ringing sound at all? It's not bothering you? Okay.
I think the hotel might be in. That's the hotel.
Oh, this is the hotel mic.
So
Yeah,
they might
okay.
need to check it in.
All right. I detected just a slight ring, and you know what happens when that goes up. In any case, so we're dealing with a worldwide plan to reduce the people of this country to the point where they will accept the loss of sovereignty. Is it all right? The loss of sovereignty, giving up of our freedoms for this New World Order. Now, what is the New World Order going to be like? It's going to be in the shape of a pyramid. How is it going to be run? You're going to have an elite at the top. The ruling elite. Where do they come from? They come from the universities. You see, the universities are preparing the ruling elite. The Hillarys and the Billarys. You see, they come out of Yale, they come out of Georgetown, and of course, Bill went to Oxford on a Rhodes scholarship. You've all heard of the Rhodes scholarships? There are a couple of thousand Rhodies in the government now. And if you understand what the Rhodes Scholarship is all about, then you know that the Rhodes Scholarship is really a selective process where they are picking the leaders of the New World government, you see. And so that's the elite at the top. Directly beneath the elite, you will have a privileged class of managers, scientists, journalists, anchor persons like Peter Jennings and Dan Blather, CEOs, educators, professors. That will be the privileged class, and they will derive their privileges from the elite at the top. And then below them you will have you and me, the hoi polloi, the masses that have to be controlled by them. So we will be conveniently dumbed down. Everybody's going to be dumbed down. Why? Well, if the elite represents the pinnacle, the standard, the highest standard of intelligence in the New World Order, then everybody else has got to be dumber than they are. I mean, if you're going to look up at Hillary Clinton as being the most intelligent human being that ever walked the face of the earth, you've got to be pretty down below that. So, in order to look up to them, Hillary and Billary, and the rest of that clique or claque or whatever you want to call them. And that's why they've got to dumb us down. Now, how are they going to dumb us down? Well, in OBE, outcome-based education, whole language is an integral part of OBE. And if you don't know what whole language is, let me explain it to you. First of all, very anti-phonics. It's the means by which they will deprive the American people of high literacy. Now, why do they want to deprive the people of high literacy? Well, so that you won't be able to read the Bible, or the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitution of the United States. They don't want Americans who believe in that they have rights, inalienable rights, or can actually read the Word of God. They're trying to get rid of that. And so they have to lower the literacy level of the American people. So how are they going to teach reading? Well, they use whole language. And how does whole language teach? Well, there's a book out called Whole Language, What's the Difference? Published in 1991 by three professors of education. And this is how they describe what whole language is about. They say this, quote, "From a whole language perspective, reading and language use in general is a process of generating hypotheses in a meaning-making transaction in a socio-historical context." Did you all get that? As a transactional process, reading is not a matter of getting the meaning from text as if that meaning were in the text waiting to be decoded by the reader. Rather, reading is a matter of readers using the cues print provide and the knowledge they bring with them of language subsystems of the world to construct a unique interpretation. Moreover, that interpretation is situated. Readers' creations, not retrievals of meaning with the text, vary depending on their purposes for reading and the expectations of others in the reading event. This view of reading implies that there is no single correct meaning for a given text, only plausible meanings. So that's the way they're going to teach reading, by changing the definition of reading, saying, hey, precision and accuracy are not important. Let the kids interpret what they're reading. Now, what limitations can you put on interpretation? None. You see, if you learn to read phonetically, you understand that you've got to read what's on the page there. You can't make it up. You can't put in your own words. You can't edit it. You've got to read it as is. That's phonetic reading. And phonics, of course, is totally excluded from whole language. Now, some whole language teachers will tell you, oh, we do teach phonics. What they do is they teach phonetic, or what they call graphophonemic cues, as part of the other strategies. You know, they have the picture cue, the context cue, the configuration cue, the syntactal cue, and then they have the graphophonemic cue. Why? Just to reduce the ridiculousness of the guessing. So if the child sees that the word begins with H, it couldn't possibly be bologna or banana, but it could be a house, hotel, horse, hearse, you name it, as long as it begins with an H. So it gives them just a little bit of a clue. But the problem with that is that it doesn't produce automaticity. In other words, it gives the child some phonetic knowledge which is then stored in the brain and occasionally used under duress, you see. In other words, it's not automatic, which is important. In order to become a good phonetic reader, it must become automatic. And they're denying the children that. They want the children to develop a holistic reflex. If you have a holistic reflex, that produces a blockage against seeing words phonetically. And therefore, it creates dyslexia. So whole language is a method by which they can deliberately create reading disorganization, symbolic disorganization, reading disability, dyslexia. Now, the Russians worked on a system of artificially creating behavioral disorganization in the 1920s and 30s, so this is not new. They know how to do it. They've been doing it for years now in American schools, and that's why 50% of American adults today can barely read and write, because it's been very successful. They have very successfully reduced the literacy level of the American people, and they intend to continue doing it. Here's another paragraph from this particular book that says, whole language represents a major shift in thinking about the reading process. Rather than viewing reading as getting the words, whole language educators view reading as essentially a process of creating meanings. Creating meanings. As a matter of fact, if I've looked through the Kentucky OBE program, and you will see they don't talk about, they describe reading as constructing meaning. That's what reading is, constructing meaning. So, creating meanings. Meaning is created through a transaction with whole meaningful texts. It is a transaction, not an extraction of the meaning from the print, in the sense that the reader created meanings are a fusion of what the reader brings and what the text offers. In a transactional model, words do not have static meanings. Rather, they have meaning potentials and the capacity to communicate multiple meanings. Well, that's a recipe for literary disaster. And that's what whole language is, and that's an integral part of OBE, and that's what your legislature has voted for, and that's what your governor has signed for. In other words, your legislature is now mandating functional illiteracy for your people. It's mandated. It's now the law. That's the way they're going to teach children to read in this state, as they're doing in Kentucky and in other OBE states. Now, to give you an idea of where OBE came from, outcomes-based education, OBE's godfather is a professor by the name of Benjamin Bloom, who, out of the University of Chicago, a social scientist, who with his colleagues, he's a behavioral scientist, part of the behavioral psychology. First, you have to understand that American education was taken over by the psychologists early in this century. Psychologists control American education from top to bottom. They're only interested in controlling behavior. They're not interested in the intellect. They're not interested in developing intelligence or intellect. They're only interested in controlling the behavior of your children because that's the only thing they can see. See, they can't see intelligence. They can't see the soul. And of course, they're basically atheists and humanists. Now, Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues decided to create a system of education which would produce the kind of society that they want. Now, what did they want? They wanted a humanistic society. So they went over education. They said, well, what do we have to do to create little humanists? You see, that was the outcome, was to create little humanists who no longer believed in God. Now, they were going to take all of these American children from different homes, from Christian homes, Jewish homes, and turn them into little humanists. So they worked on on this problem of taking these children and turning them into little humanists, because the end product is to be this humanist world government. And incidentally, if you have any doubts about what the humanists stand for or what they want, just get a copy of the Humanist Manifestos 1 and 2. Explains it all. You want to know what the American, where we're getting our curriculum from? It's from here. Humanist Manifestos. See, now when the Catholics created the Catholic schools, they had outcomes too. That was an outcome-based education. What was this? The outcome of a Catholic school, to produce a believing Catholic who would also be well educated and be able to contribute to society and have a career or whatever. But basically, it was to produce a believing Catholic, the catechism. That was, and what's the outcome of a fundamentalist Christian school? It's to create a Bible-believing individual who will then lead his life according to God's law. So now if you're going to create a humanist society, you've got to have an education system that produces humanists. Now, how do you do that? First of all, you've got to deal with the fact that these children are not coming out of humanist homes. It's not as if you're a humanist parent putting your child in a humanist school. I mean, Catholic parents put their children in Catholic schools. Christian parents put their children in Christian schools. Fundamentalist parents put their children in a fundamentalist school. Jewish parents put their kids in Hebrew day schools. So is there a large body of humanist parents out there who want their children to go to a humanist school? Are there humanist schools around? Yes, there are. They're called public schools. Because when the psychologists and the progressives took over public education at the turn of the century, they gradually changed them into humanist schools. How do we know that? Well, they all teach sex education, they all teach values clarification, they all teach everything that's calculated to produce a humanist result. But now what they're doing with OBE is they're saying, hey, let's just sweep the table clear and start from the very beginning and create a humanist system from the bottom up. We don't want anything left over from the previous system. We want to get rid of every last vestige of traditional education. And that's what OBE does. It starts at the very beginning. They're going to remake the system entirely. Now, Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues produced a very important book entitled The Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. Now, what is a taxonomy? What is a taxonomy? A taxonomy, according to Bloom, and I'm going to quote him, is, this taxonomy is designed to be a classification of the student behaviors which represent the intended outcomes of the educational process. What we are classifying is the intended behavior of students, the ways in which individuals are to act, think, or feel as a result of participating in some unit of instruction. So now they're dealing with feelings, emotions, beliefs. Now, when I was going to school back in 1931, in the first grade, and my teacher was teaching me to read, she hadn't the faintest interest in what I felt. She couldn't have cared less what my feelings were or my beliefs were. I came from an immigrant Jewish family. She didn't care where I came from. She was determined to teach me to read English. That's all. That was her job, and she did an excellent job. It's the same with the arithmetic, spelling, all those wonderful subjects. They were not interested in tampering with your feelings. In other words, when you came to school, she didn't want to undo what your parents did. She didn't want to change anything of your values. What she wanted to do was add to your knowledge, give you skills that you didn't have, skills which your parents sent you to school to acquire. That's what she wanted. But now the system is different, you see. The taxonomy is not completely neutral, Bloom writes. This stems from the already noted fact that it is a classification of intended behaviors. By educational objectives, we mean explicit formulations of the ways in which students are expected to be changed by the educative process. Changed. That is, the ways in which they will change in their thinking, their feelings, and their actions. Well, now the interesting thing about outcome-based education, which is run by behavioral scientists, is that they were very concerned with the fact that children came to school with their values already shaped by their parents. You know, when you went to school at the age of 5 and 6, you've picked up the vocabulary of your parents. If your parents are Bible believers, religious individuals who've taken you to church, you've picked up quite a vocabulary regarding your religion, regarding God, etc., etc. And so, for many children, their values are fixed. And the behavioral scientists like Bloom realized that. So this is how they were going to deal with this problem. They wrote, this is what Bloom wrote. He said, the evidence points out convincingly to the fact that age is a factor operating against attempts to effect a complete or thoroughgoing reorganization of attitudes and values. Age is a factor operating against attempts to effect a complete or thoroughgoing reorganization of attitudes and values. A thoroughgoing reorganization. That means de-Christianizing these kids. I didn't go to school to have my values thoroughly reorganized, or to have my or to undergo a complete reorganization of attitudes. That wasn't the purpose of school when I was going to school. That was parents' business. That was something that parents were concerned about, not schools. He says, the evidence collected thus far suggests that a single hour of classroom activity under certain conditions may bring about a major reorganization in cognitive as well as affective behaviors. We are of the opinion that this will prove to be a most fruitful area of research in connection with the affective domain. Now, that was written in the 60s, so they've made a great deal of progress. And in fact, when he talks about the affective domain, you have to understand that what the humanists have done is divided the American school curriculum into two parts, the cognitive domain and the affective domain. The cognitive domain is supposed to be concerned with reading, writing, arithmetic, basic facts, while the affective domain concerns values, beliefs, attitudes, sexuality, all of that stuff that is now, so heavily concentrated on in the schools today. Now, when I was going to school, there was no such thing as the affective domain. That was considered beyond the purview of the school. That was not the school's business. Today, it is it's the major concern of the schools, is the so-called affective domain. So he says that, listen, we've got this, we scientists are so clever that under certain conditions, a single hour of classroom activity may bring about a major reorganization in cognitive as well as affective behaviors. A single hour of classroom activity. What are they doing? What can they possibly do? Well, I'll give you an example of what was done here in Michigan, in the town of Canton. There was a second grader who was shown in his class a film on suicide. And the next night, you know what he did? He hanged himself in his home. I don't know how many of you have heard of Debbie Nalepa, the mother of the boy, who had no idea that her child was seeing this film. She said, my child was not suicidal. He wasn't suicidal at all. Stephen wasn't suicidal. He was just copying what he had seen in the film. Now, she didn't even know that he had seen a film. She found out about the film through his classmates. She asked them, she said, why do you think Stephen did this? And they said, oh, we saw this movie, we saw this film in the class. That was the first she'd heard of this. There have been no letters asking permission to show a second grader a film on suicide. No indication whatever that this was about this. And this was an experienced teacher, ready to retire. This was not a young teacher who didn't know what she was doing. This was a teacher who knew exactly what she was doing. You know how they get those films? You put in a request for the film. There's a central warehouse or storage place or wherever. These films are brought to the school in a truck, delivered to the school. The teacher shows the film. Next day, it's put back on the truck. It's taken out of the school, driven away. Nobody knows. There's no indication of what was shown or anything like that. So Debbie then and her husband decided to sue the school system, decided to sue the Canton school system, the teacher, the superintendent, everybody involved, with negligence, with educational malpractice, or whatever you want to call it. Obviously, that youngster would not have hanged himself if he hadn't seen that film. Well, do you know what the result in the court was? Now, who did she sue? She sued Encyclopedia Britannica, which produced the film. This is no small operation. These are not being done by little old ladies in backyards. This is being done by major corporations. These are products coming out of the establishment. She sued them all, and the result was that the judge threw out the case, saying that freedom of speech, that all of these people were protected by the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and therefore Debbie Nalepa had no recourse to anything. So there's an example of how 1 hour of classroom activity can indeed change a child's life forever. That's how they do it. They don't tell you. Very hard to find out. And then the courts block your way to any sort of compensation or whatever to correct this situation. So they can go on doing this now forever because there's no accountability. They're not responsible for the results of their products. I was talking to a young man who had never been taught phonics in the schools, and as a result has had a handicap, which has prevented him from reaching a higher level of employment because he has this reading handicap. And I explained it to him how this was done deliberately. Because after all, we know how to teach reading. It's no big deal. I mean, I was taught it back in the days when they knew what they were doing. They still know what they're doing. So he looks at me, he says, should I sue them? I said, well, you can try. You can try. There have been cases of families that have sued the schools for producing functionally illiterate or functional literacy or dyslexia. But again, the judges have thrown the cases out of court because in the first instance in San Francisco, the judge said, well, the school has no obligation to teach a child to read. Their only obligation is custodial. In the second case, the court refused to get involved in the matter of educational malpractice because they said, we don't have the expertise. They could have called in experts. They could have called me in if they'd wanted to. And others, Rudolph Flesch and others who were around at the time of that case, but they didn't. In other words, the courts are protecting the educators. The educators are now get away with murder, and there's nothing you can do about it except remove your children from the schools and homeschool. That's the last freedom left. And it's important for you to take advantage of that because that's the only way you're going to protect your children these days. You cannot trust the public schools, and you can't trust many of the private schools because they're getting involved in this also. Now, just to give you an idea of what the thinking of the elite is on these matters, let me quote to you from some of the top people in the elite, what their thinking is, how they justify what they're doing. For example, in 1981, Professor Anthony Ottinger of Harvard University spoke to 52 executives of the Northern Telecom Corporation. Here's a copy of the Innisbrook Papers, the symposium. And this is what he told these executives, trying to prepare them for the kind of literacy that the schools are going to produce. He said this, he said, quote, "The present traditional concept of literacy has to do with the ability to read and write. But the real question that confronts us today is how do we help citizens function well in their society? How can they acquire the skills necessary to solve their problems? Do we really want to teach people to do a lot of sums or write in a fine round hand when they have a $5 handheld calculator or a word processor to work with? Or do we really have to have everybody literate, writing and reading in the traditional manner when we have the means through our technology to achieve a new flowering of oral communication? It is the traditional idea that says certain forms of communication, such as comic books, are bad, but in the modern context of functionalism, they may not be all that bad." Unquote. Now, I wonder how many parents send their children to school to learn to read comic books. I mean, parents send their children to school to learn to read and write in the traditional manner, because that's the only way that they will learn to read and write. And here is a top professor, social scientist, telling the corporate executives, hey, we don't have to have all these people literate. They don't have to know how to read and write. We could use oral communication. It's already come into a being. You know what oral communication is? We call it rap. That's what the result has been. What are all those gangs in Los Angeles? They're all functionally illiterate. And they get together and they produce gangs. And because they have no employable skills, what do they resort to? Drugs, delinquency, robbery, killing, etc. Also, we have discovered that there's a great correlation between violence and reading problems. That children with reading problems, because of the extreme frustration that they go through, become very violent and antisocial. And so they become little walking time bombs. So if you get 10,000 walking time bombs gathered into a gang, you get the kind of social explosion that occurred in Los Angeles. That was a social explosion on the part of these functional illiterates who are little walking time bombs of hatred because of the frustration that these schools have caused them. The government, you see, they have no love of the government schools because they know that when they entered the government school at the age of 5 and 6, they felt very intelligent. Why did they feel intelligent? Well, because they all taught themselves to speak their own language, you know. Every child does, every normal child. And so they entered school feeling very confident that they could learn to read. After all, they taught themselves to speak their own language. That's a pretty difficult thing to do for a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old. And so they said, hey, we can learn to read. But then the methods that the schools use deliberately shut down that language learning dynamo and create an incredible sense of frustration because suddenly these kids find out that they can't learn to read and they think they're stupid. Because the school won't take the blame for what's happening. They'll say, well, it's the kid's fault. There's something wrong with the kid. He's learning disabled. He's dyslexic. He's got problems. He comes from a broken home. Whatever, or his parents are divorced, or it's the Vietnam War, or it's nuclear fallout, or it's the ozone, you know. Nothing wrong with the school, nothing wrong with the methods being used in the school, but we know that these methods were devised by the world's leading psychologists. Whole language, the look-say method, these methods were not devised by nice old ladies sitting on back porches. They were devised by the world's leading behavioral psychologists. They know how the mind works. They can cripple a mind in just a couple of months. They can take a nice, normal, young mind, intelligent mind, and cripple that mind permanently in a space of 2 months. That's why I advise parents that under no circumstances should they put their child in the primary grades in a public school. Absolutely not. The risk is much too great. You may have a teacher here or there who teaches phonics, but he or she will be in the minority. They'll be a tiny minority, and they'll be doing it on the sly. Because now, intensive systematic phonics is simply considered, it's practically against the law now. It's practically illegal for a teacher to try to do that. So teachers take great risks. And many of these teachers just get tired of fighting the system. They give up because they know they're going to be harassed and punished for doing the right thing. So I tell parents, under no circumstance should you put your child in a primary public school because you're just condemning that child to a crippled life. A life that can be crippled by these people who know how to do it. Remember, they've been experimenting in their laboratories all these years. So here is Professor Ottinger saying, do we really have to have everybody literate? Do we really need to? Who is the we? You know who the we is? The elite. Do we, the elite, we the rulers, need to have all of those people literate? Of course not. We're the elite. We'll do all the thinking for them. They don't have to think. They don't have to do anything but follow our directions. They'll do what we tell them to do. Here's another quote from a man by the name of Thomas Sticht. He's supposed to be an expert in adult literacy. And guess who he works for? He's an assistant to Mr. Robert Reich. Are there any ditto heads here? Robert Reich, who was our Secretary of Labor. Now here's Sticht, who's in one of the highest positions in our government. What does he say? He says, quote, he said this in 1987, quote, many companies have moved operations to places with cheap, relatively poorly educated labor. What may be crucial, they say, is the dependability of a labor force and how well it can be managed and trained, not its general educational level. Although a small cadre of highly educated, creative people is essential to innovation and growth, ending discrimination and changing values are probably more important than reading and moving low-income families into the middle class, unquote. Wow, you could write a book about that paragraph. What is he saying? He's saying, hey fellas, forget about the American dream. Forget about the American dream. We're not going to be moving low-class, poor people into the middle class. No, we've got to change their values. We've got to make them satisfied with their low-class status, you see. Because reading is not as important as ending discrimination and changing values, you see. And then he says, oh yeah, we do need some people who can read. This small cadre of highly educated, creative people, like Hillary and Billary. They're very creative. Here's this woman who was elected by nobody, who suddenly has the power to impose on the American people a totally socialistic medical system. She's a member of the elite, of the university elite. You see, she went to Yale University. So naturally, she was chosen by Gaia or somebody, to do the bidding of of this new world order. So there you have it. This small cadre of highly educated, creative people is essential to innovation and growth. The interesting thing about that is that so many companies are not started by this small cadre of highly educated people, but are generally created by entrepreneurs, some of whom have not been to college, or some of whom have dropped out of college. Like, the man who created Microsoft dropped out. Stephen Jobs of Macintosh, of Apple Computer, he dropped out. He wasn't learning anything in school. So it's not this precious cadre. Of course, he includes himself in it, Thomas Stick and Mr. Reich and all of that bunch. They're the elite, you see. So that's what they're preparing for us. Massive illiteracy, a dumbed-down nation, de-Christianized children, and it's called OBE. And your legislator voted for it, and your governor signed it, and he doesn't even know what he signed. We had the same thing happen in Massachusetts. Nobody even knew what was being passed. It was done by stealth. See, in Kentucky, it had high visibility. Very high visibility in Kentucky. It had high visibility in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact, the parents have been opposed to this and have been fighting it for years. Do you think that it changed the legislature? Do you think that it changed the governor's mind? No. They went right ahead with it because those people have total and complete contempt for the parents of this country. What they're telling the parents is that we own your children. How dare you oppose us? We own your children. We're going to do with your children what we want. If we don't want them to learn to read, that's our business. We make the decisions, not you. As he said, do we really have to have everybody literate? Do we really? We, the elite. So that's what we're dealing with. Now, when you have a society, when you're headed toward that kind of a society, toward a controlled world government, new world government society, you've got to have the means of control. And you know how their means of control is through these wonderful computers. They now have the National Center for Education Statistics in the 70s was already working on a massive computer system that would gather data on every single individual entering a school. Here is a copy of it to show you what kind of information they're getting. Personal information, personal identification, name, student number. Everybody's going to have a number. Family and residence, everything about the parents. Family economic information, family social cultural information. Then health, medical history, sensory, physical and related conditions, mental, psychological, and proficiency test results and related student characteristics. This is the information they want that's going to be in the computer. Goes on and on. This is 1970s. It's probably quite perfected by now. The machinery is all in place. So these kids now, all of this will be in their, as a matter of fact, I did a newsletter on it. The data collection for the New World Order. Now, they realize that they've got to get hold of these kids as early as possible. So here's the Carnegie Corporation, because that's part of Goals 2000. You know what the first goal is in Goals 2000, which is related to all of this, is that the children should be ready to learn by the time they go to school. You know, I don't know of a child that is born who isn't ready to learn. I mean, everybody's ready to learn. The minute you're out, you're ready to learn. But they're going to make sure. So the Carnegie Corporation has been working on this ready-to-learn bit for quite some time because they realized, hey, we've got to get these kids early. Benjamin Bloom told us that age is a factor. So we've got to get control of these kids as early as possible. How early? In the womb. In the womb, believe it or not. Now, how are they going to do that? Well, by monitoring pregnancies now. The Carnegie program here's what the Carnegie program calls for. Calling the birth to 3 span the most critical period in a child's development, but the most neglected by policymakers. An expert panel is proposing a broad blueprint for improvements in education, child and health care, and community services to support young children and their families. In a report scheduled for release this week, a Carnegie Corporation of New York task force highlights compelling research evidence on the importance of the first 3 years of life. The crucially formative years of early childhood have become a time of peril and loss for millions of children and their families, writes David A. Hamburg, president of the Carnegie Corporation. And so, etc. They're going to systematically begin monitoring pregnancies. They call that prenatal period, birth, and the first 3 years. And all that's going to be on the computer. Now, the Carnegie Corporation released their report on April 13th, 1994, just a couple of months ago. No sooner did the Carnegie Corporation issue them their report than who do you think arranged for a big meeting to discuss it? Hillary Clinton, you see. 20th of April. How many days is that? 14th to the 20th. 6 days later, a Carnegie Corporation of New York report sounding the alarm about a quiet crisis facing the nation's youngest children evoked a loud and emotional outpouring of support from top government, business, health, and education officials at a meeting here in Washington last week. Hillary Rodham Clinton, the first speaker, conceded that it will take uncommon political will and institutional fortitude to fill the report's mandate. But there is reason for optimism, she said, simply because of the players involved. This room is filled with people who are willing to work to make it happen. Who are those people in the room? They're all paid by your government. All government employees, bureaucrats. There they are. They're so concerned that they have evoked a loud and emotional outpouring of support for this thing. Do you ever hear of a bureaucrat having a loud and emotional outpouring of anything? This is all such phony baloney. And the Boston Globe of April 23rd, 1994, so that's 3 days later, says, Head Start could soon be reaching out to pregnant women, infants, and many more working families 3 decades after it first touched the lives of the nation's poorest preschool children. In a late-night vote Thursday, the Senate agreed to expand and improve the comprehensive Early Childhood Development Program, now serving about 720,000 children, most of them 3 to 5 years old. The Senate's vote comes a week after the Carnegie Corporation, a New York philanthropy, warned that the nation's infants and toddlers are in trouble and that their healthy development and ultimately the country's economic strength are at risk. Isn't this amazing? The Carnegie Corporation issues a report, and about a week later, the Senate is already voting on it. That's power. That's power. That's incredible power. Is there anything that you and I do that can get to the Congress and be voted on so quickly? You see, the Carnegie Corporation has been controlling American education for many years now. The Carnegie Corporation has been formulating the plans. You know, you think the National Education Association is independent? They're a labor union. They take their orders from the Carnegie Corporation. Let me see, what time is it? Maybe we can take, if you have some questions. When does this end? At 1:45. Well, it's already. Well, let me give you 5 more minutes, and then I could. Yeah.
Is that Dale Carnegie?
Oh no. These are the corporations, the philanthropic corporations started by Andrew Carnegie. Now, who was Andrew Carnegie? He started U.S. Steel. He was a Scotsman who came to this country and made millions of dollars. And he, along with, at the turn of the century, you see, there was a man by the name of Cecil Rhodes. How many here have heard of Cecil Rhodes? Cecil Rhodes made his money in South Africa. He went there as a young man and got involved in diamond mining and gold and created an incredible fortune. But he also had an idea. He had an idea for world government run by the English-speaking world. He considered the English-speaking peoples to be superior to all others, and he said, to create this world government, this new world order, we have to create a secret society. A secret society. In fact, I will give you a very succinct description of what he had in mind. He said, the only thing feasible to carry out this idea is a secret society gradually absorbing the wealth of the world to be devoted to such an object. He said that in 1895 or something like that. It's all documented. It was in the New York Times. I'll give you the exact date. The New York Times, March 26, 1902. That's when he died. And his will, what was in his will came out. He wanted to create this secret society for this world government to be run by the English-speaking world. But the most important thing, he said that the only thing feasible to carry out this idea is a secret society gradually absorbing the wealth of the world. Gradually absorbing the wealth of the world. This is what he said. He said, listen, you rich people, why are you leaving your money to these profligate heirs of yours? Put it into this new idea, into this secret society for a world government, then you will be doing some good, because he said, we will eliminate war, we will have perpetual peace, and it'll be good for everybody. You see, it was one of these utopian ideas which people frequently have, but which wind up doing an enormous amount of harm. Now, Carnegie was one of the men he recruited, because Carnegie also believed in the same idea. And there was a man in this country by the name of Nicholas Murray Butler, president of Columbia University, who became the agent of the Rhodes conspiracy. Now, when Rhodes died, he left some of his money for what he called the Rhodes Scholarships. The Rhodes Scholarships were a front for the secret organization, for the secret society. The Rhodes Scholarship would recruit young future leaders who would bring about this New World Order. And it just so happens that our friend Bill Clinton and many of his colleagues were Rhodes Scholars. Isn't that a coincidence? Funny it should happen that way. And here's the Carnegie Corporation, which then they also recruited the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation. They have gathered up all of this money, and then they instituted an income tax to make sure that the American people didn't have the money to resist. See, it costs money to put over a world government. Lots and lots of money. And it costs money to resist it, because you've got to have newspapers, you've got to be able to own radio stations. Well, who do you think's been buying up all the newspapers and the radio networks? The other side. They have all the money in the world now. They've been gathering. That's what the secret society's been doing all these years, gathering up the cash, the money, the assets, and turning it to their use. And occasionally there'll be somebody who will be opposed to them who gains some kind of a voice, like a Rush Limbaugh. But even Rush Limbaugh will not touch this subject. He does not go into conspiracies. He does not go into any of this stuff, because they know better. They know that it's bad enough, the opposition they have, but it's getting hot. It's getting hotter. And now they're coming out against the fundamentalist Christians. It's really rabid now. It's almost like they're almost hysterically against the so-called religious right, because they see that we're beginning to win elections. So their power depends on their controlling the Congress of the United States and the state legislatures of the United States and the presidency, the White House. You know, it was George Bush who uttered those words, New World Order, because Bush is part of it. A good many Republicans, that's why they hate Ollie North. They don't want anybody in the Republican Party who's going to deviate them, divert them from their goal, New World Order. And they felt from the very beginning they had to control the State Department, the Congress, the presidency, and the education system, because they've got to prepare the children for this New World Order. I did a newsletter entitled Who Controls American Education?, in which I showed how, incidentally, all of this has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. All you have to do is read. Well, let me give you an example. When Bill Clinton accepted the nomination for the presidency at the Democratic National Convention, he paid homage in his speech to a professor by the name of Carroll Quigley. Now, 99.9% of the American people had no idea who Carroll Quigley was. They figured he was just talking about his teacher the way we talk about Miss Smith in the first grade, you know, who did such a good job. Who was Carroll Quigley? Those of us in the know immediately knew what Clinton was referring to. He was referring to his professor who had written the book about the conspiracy. Carroll Quigley had written a book entitled Tragedy and Hope in the 1960s, in which he said, quote, and I'm quoting from his book, page 950, "There does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the Round Table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups and frequently does. I know of the operations of this network because I have studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine its papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it and to many of its instruments. I have objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, but in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known." He was Bill Clinton's mentor, and Bill Clinton 2 years later got his Rhodes Scholarship, because Quigley did the book on the Rhodes conspiracy. It's a book entitled The Anglo-American Establishment. And in that book, he gives the entire history of the whole Rhodes secret society and how they formed the Rhodes Scholarships to be their front for the recruitment of the young leaders of tomorrow who would bring about Rhodes's plan. And that's what we've got now. Half the cabinet, or half of Clinton's staff is made up of Rhodes scholars. Ira Magaziner, Strobe Talbot, Stephanopoulos, Clinton himself. There's so many of them in high places. We've had, in other words, we're able to document this backwards and forwards. But this is information that's not readily available to the American people. How many people are going to sit down and read Tragedy and Hope if they can find it? The book was very hastily drawn out of circulation as soon as people on our side became aware of what Quigley was informing us of. Quigley was saying, hey fellas, yeah, there is a conspiracy. It does exist. I know it. I've examined their secret papers. They trust me. That was a serious mistake he made, because then they turned on him and he died in obscurity. They withdrew his book. Macmillan had published it. Top company, Macmillan. So a group of private people have reprinted the book. So you can get hold of it. You can actually read it if you want to. They've gotten hold of it. Well, anyway, that's what OBE is. It's the tip of the iceberg, the educational iceberg. It's to take your children and to make them into loyal robots for the New World Order, according to the recipes and precepts of Benjamin Bloom and his proteges, etc. Now, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Yes, sir.
In your opinion, how do all of the talented and gifted programs play into it?
Well, the talented and gifted programs are specifically created to weed out the intelligent kids, the ones who can read, to make sure that they become the potential leaders in the humanist system. And how are they going to do this? First of all, they say, oh, you're so talented, and you're so wonderful, and you're so gifted, and we love you, and they pet their hair, and they give them all sorts of things, and they say, and we're going to get you good jobs in the United Nations. you see. We're going to send you around the world because you are the elite. So that's what the gifted and talented are used for. They realize that there are in the masses, some very gifted kids. Remember, who was Bill Clinton? Where did he come out of? He was gifted and talented. He came from a rather low-class family. Hillary came, I think her father was a salesman or something like that, or a doctor. I'm not sure what her father was. But these are ordinary kids. They know that the ranks of the leaders of the future are going to come from the ordinary people, so they've got to be able to, they have to have a means of selecting them out, relegating the rest to the trash heap. They're going to be the proles, the robots of the society. Yes, ma'am.
Could you explain briefly what changes take place in the classroom that is instituted over
Well, what takes place in the classroom is, first of all, what they're doing is they're saying that everybody can learn the same thing. And so they will have these modules which you will have to demonstrate through some sort of activity that you have learned what they are teaching. In other words, if they're teaching evolution, you have to demonstrate that you understand and agree with evolution. Because if you're not going to agree with evolution, you're not going to pass. And if you're not going to pass, you're going to stay in school as long as it takes for you to mouth what they want to hear. That's what the demonstrations, the behavioral demonstration is all about. You see, you're not going to be tested on what you know, but you're going to be tested on what your attitudes are, what your feelings are, not on your knowledge. In other words, they don't care whether or not you know anything about the Constitution. First of all, what did Sixth say? He said, we don't need all these educated people. We only need a small cadre of educated people. See, as long as Americans can be trained like Koreans and Filipinos, the Filipinos don't know anything about the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. They're good workers. So Americans don't have to know all about these things that only clutter up the place, you know. Just teach them enough to function. They talk a lot about functionalism, you see. Enough reading so that they can function at the level that the government wants them to function as a drone, you see. And the classroom activities are to, for example, they're down on basic knowledge, but they're up on processing knowledge, you see. It's a very strange thing. It's not going to work. It's not going to, because it's so totally anti-human, so totally against human nature. But look what happened in Russia. The communists spent 70 years imposing an inhuman system on the people there, and the result was devastating. Millions were murdered, millions were killed and enslaved, and the result is that the richest nation on earth with more resources than any other nation is in poverty. So OBE is not going to succeed. It's simply going to create great misery, and it's going to lower the living standards of the American people. I can go into the detail of what they do in the classroom, but what I was trying to do here is give you an overall idea of what this is all about, because you can get lost in the nitty-gritty of what they're going to do in the classroom. But I give you the general idea of the drift of what they're doing. That's the best I can do in an hour and 15 minutes. Yes.
How are they selling the teachers that are in there that want to teach the 3 hours?
Well, the way they're selling this to the teachers, they're using group dynamics, group decision-making. The teachers are being brainwashed through group peer pressure, you see. In other words, you're not going to have any longer the eccentric, independent teacher who teaches his or her way. You're going to have teachers who are working in groups and answerable to the group. That's how they're going to control the teachers. Now, some of the teachers are getting a little uneasy about this. They're becoming rebellious, particularly in Kentucky. Teachers are beginning to write letters to newspapers. I quote one letter, which is really masterful. This man describes the evils of this whole system. But yet Kentucky is still going on with it. you see. So that's how they're going to control the teachers. Yes, sir.
I'm frustrated with Christian leaders when we're talking about homeschooling that are saying that you shouldn't necessarily homeschool because we're pulling the light and salt out of school. I was curious as to what you would answer people like that. Give me some ammunition.
Well, the point is this. Children are not missionaries. They don't have the training. They're too young. They're going to be manipulated. There's no sense setting up a conflict. There's no sense sending your child to school to do battle. You know, your child is not a soldier. Your child wants to be taught, and you have a duty as a parent to make sure that your child gets the best education possible. And you can't you can't do that by putting your child in a war. Because what happens in war? You have casualties. That's not the place for children. I'm not saying that Christian teachers ought not to be in the schools. They ought to be there as long as they can. But they will be generally weeded out because the Carnegie Corporation also has this plan for national certification, which the NEA is all for, of course. Why? Because they will be testing. You see, now if you want to become a teacher, all you have to do is take a certain amount of courses, and you get your certificate. But now they want to test your beliefs, your values. They want to see if you can fit in to the system, and they will be able to weed out Christians who will want to get into the system, or else the Christians will have to be, what does it say, as peaceful as doves and as smart as... yes. Right. How far is the NEA and the Carnegie Corporation willing to go to declare homeschooling illegal? Well, the NEA, of course, in its resolutions has already stated that they disfavor homeschooling. They want homeschoolers to be certified, that is, the parents to be certified. They want the homeschoolers to be forced to accept a state curriculum. That's what they want. So we know what their attitude is. The Carnegie Corporation hasn't said very much because they're so busy, rearranging the public school system. But you can be sure that they are not very happy with the growth of the homeschool movement because you people are not going to be on the computer. You people are going to be out there. You're the loose cannons, you see. You represent a great potential danger to them. So you can be sure that they're going to try to do things. Look at, they're doing it right now. They've got your legislature and a Republican governor to sign this into law. Who knows what will come next? Yes, ma'am.
Well, just as an example of how some individual teachers feel about this, I have former teachers, now an education writer, and I had two teachers from my elementary district come to me and say, "Oh, Martha, you have got to come into the system and substitute to see what is going on." And one of these teachers had been evaluated by the superintendent very recently, superintendent, good change agent, and her evaluation of one of these teachers who's been there about 20 years was, you do a wonderful job relating to the children, you can see that your students like you, but the problem is you still think academic education is important. This was an evaluation, and I told the president of the Board of Education this, of course, not using the teacher's name. She didn't have to tell me that would be dangerous. And he said to me, "Oh, well, Martha, you really should look at our mission statement because we're all for academic learning." Well, number one, the mission statement doesn't say that. And number two, I finally said to him, there is an awful lot of double talk going on here. And that was it. I have no way of knowing whether he acted on this or not. I suspect that he did.
Yes. Well, that's a very good points made, Martha. What the teachers are going through in the schools. There's a lot of opposition from teachers because they feel that their job is to teach, and they're being instructed and told to do differently. They don't like it, but then you do have that cadre of teachers who do like exactly what's going on and are for it. And they're the ones in the forefront. They're the ones who attend the school board meetings, when they discuss the new reform. Incidentally, OBE is going to cost all of you a lot of money because educational malpractice is very expensive. It's not cheap turning children into functional illiterates. You need special training books, you need special textbooks, you need specially trained teachers. It's not easy keeping kids in school for 12 years and making sure that they don't learn to read and write. What do you do for those 12 years? Well, you pretend to teach. That's what you do. And you change attitudes. Yes, sir.
I teach in a public high school. I'm a science teacher.
Right.
We've worked on outcomes, goals.
Right.
And I have not seen anything of what you're saying. We're an outcome-based school. I haven't seen anything related to attitudes as far as science curriculum is concerned. We're dealing with
yes.
You need to learn these facts, you need to
right.
learn these things. And we haven't dealt with any kind of attitude or behavioral issues at all.
Well, this gentleman is a teacher is it a high school?
Yeah.
A high school teacher, and he says, and they're using outcome-based education. He says that they're not dealing with attitudes, etc. Of course not, because you're in the cognitive domain, you see. You're not dealing with the affective domain. In other words, they leave that to others. So you're doing your work in your science, and it's pretty much like you've always done it. You've got to teach certain facts, H2O and all of that, and what is it, chemistry? Do you teach many different, all right. But then they slip in evolution somewhere along the line, maybe not in your class, but where the damage is done is in the social sciences, the social studies, in reading, in...
They don't slip in evolution.
Well, they don't slip it in, it's there.
Evolution is what's taught.
Right, it's taught. That's right. Yeah, that's all they teach.
And what is the Christian response?
Zilch.
That's right. That's right.
No, the Christians have no response because they have no say in what goes on in the public schools any longer. That's why I tell Christian parents, stop knocking your heads against a stone wall. You're only going to experience frustration and more frustration. It's time to leave the system. It's time to get out. It's time to take the education of your children into your own hands and do it the way you want to do it. You want educational reform? You can have it tomorrow by taking your child out and giving them the education you want. If you're going to try to reform the system, how are you going to fight the Carnegie Corporation? How are you going to fight national certification? How are you going to fight the MEA and the NEA? You can't. They're not going to change for your benefit. By the time anything is done, your child will be out of school completely. Your child's only going to be 6 years old 1 year, period. That's it. So you've got to do it yourselves. Yes?
In our state of Maryland, outcome-based education, the goal is the year 2000, the graduating class will graduate fully under the system. And a test was given to a third grade class. One of the questions for the third graders was, discuss the civil rights of a nude dancer. And,
Of a nude dancer?
Of a nude dancer. And I called our Board of Education as a parent, of course, we homeschool, but I said, as a tax-paying parent, I would like to see a copy of this test. And sorry, this is, can't remember the term they used, but it would violate the integrity of the test for them to send me a copy, so it wasn't. But some places don't have it, like maybe this gentleman's school, in every course or whatever, but the seeds of this are all over the country, and eventually it will be there.
And incidentally, there are 3 forms of OBE. There's sort of like a bit of OBE. Then there's what they call a intermediate type of OBE, and then there's transformational OBE, which is really a total overhaul of the school, because they know that some schools are doing very well as they are. They don't need reform. So what they do is they put in an intermediate form of OBE, which does not upset too much because the kids are doing very well, the scores are high, and they're saying, well, we don't need reform. We're doing very well, you see. So there are these three different stages in OBE implementation. And I don't know what it is in your school. It might very well be, for example, do you still have summer vacations? Well, then you haven't reached the ultimate. The transformational OBE will do away with summer vacations. You're going to have year-round schooling, you see. Yes, ma'am.
When I was on school, they said, they were talking about year-round school.
Yes.
When my sister's child went to school, where I grew up.
Incidentally, there is going to be a statewide rally against outcome-based education. I have a circular up here that I'd like every one of you to get and to give it to your friends or to yourselves if you can. This will be a march, it'll be on the steps of the state capitol on September 29th, Thursday, September 29th at 12 noon. So if you can get out to Lansing, fine. My newsletters are on sale at my table, which is on the left wall as you go into the big hall. I want to thank you for your attention. I hope I've been instructive and a little informative. Thank you very much.